The main hall of the city's busiest transportation hub was a massive place, filled with the constant echo of thousands of shoes hitting the hard stone floor. It was a place where nobody wanted to be, yet everyone had to pass through. The air smelled of strong coffee, pretzels, and the metallic scent of the trains that arrived and departed every few minutes. The ceiling was high and glass, letting in streams of pale afternoon light that made the dust motes dance in the air. In the very center of this wide, busy walkway stood a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, shiny and black, looking slightly out of place among the crowds of people rushing to their next destination. It was an open invitation for anyone to sit down and play, but most days, it just sat there empty, gathering fingerprints from curious children and serving as a resting spot for tired travelers' bags. On this particular Tuesday, the piano was not empty. An elderly man sat on the bench. He looked like he had been carved out of old wood, his frame thin and his shoulders slightly rounded under a worn brown coat. His hair was white and thin, combed back neatly from a face that was lined with deep wrinkles. He wore simple trousers and shoes that had been polished many years ago but had since lost their shine. To the hundreds of people walking by, he looked like just another old man, maybe waiting for a bus or killing time before a doctor's appointment. He was the kind of person eyes usually slide right past, invisible in the crowd. But then his hands moved. When his fingers touched the ivory keys, the transformation was instant. The old man's back straightened just a little, and his eyes, which had been staring vacantly at the floor, suddenly focused intently on the music stand in front of him. He didn't have any sheet music, though. The page was blank. He was playing from memory, pulling notes out of the air. He started to play a piece of classical music that was complicated and beautiful. The sound was rich and full, spilling out from the piano and filling the cold hall with warmth. It wasn't just noise, it was a story. The melody drifted high and clear, soaring over the heads of the commuters, while the lower notes provided a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. The music was technically perfect. Every note was crisp, every chord was balanced. It was the kind of sound that belonged in a grand concert hall, where people pay hundreds of dollars to sit in velvet seats and hold their breath. But here, in the middle of the station, it was free. And sadly, mostly ignored. A young businessman in a suit walked past, his phone pressed to his ear, shouting into the microphone about a meeting that was running late. He didn't even look up as the old man hit a particularly difficult run of notes, his fingers flying across the keyboard with impossible speed. The businessman was too busy to hear the beauty happening 3 feet away from him. A group of tourists walked by, looking at a large map, arguing loudly about which exit would take them to the museum. One of them bumped into the side of the piano, shaking the instrument slightly, but didn't even apologize to the old man. They just kept walking, their voices drowning out the gentle, sad melody the man was coaxing from the strings. A mother rushed by, dragging a young child by the hand. The child stopped for a second, attracted by the noise, and looked at the piano with wide eyes. "Mommy, listen," the child said, pointing a small finger. "Come on, sweetie, we have to go," the mother said, pulling the child along without breaking her stride. "We can't be late. Keep moving." The old man didn't react to any of this. He didn't look up, hoping for praise. He didn't stop playing when people bumped the bench or shouted nearby. He just kept playing. It seemed as though he was in a glass bubble, separated from the chaotic world rushing around him. For him, the world had shrunk down to the 88 black and white keys in front of him. He played with a deep emotion that felt out of place in such a busy, uncaring setting. He pressed the pedals with his scuffed shoes, sustaining the notes so they rang out into the distance. He swayed slightly with the music, feeling the rhythm in his chest. There was a look of peace on his face, a rare kind of calm that you don't see often in the city. It was the look of a man doing exactly what he was born to do, even if the world had decided it no longer had time for him. The piece he was playing grew louder and more intense. His hands moved faster, crossing over each other, striking the keys with a force that seemed too strong for his frail arms. The music filled every corner of the hall. It was the kind of sound that should have stopped traffic. It should have made people put down their coffee cups and pause their conversations. It should have commanded respect. But the station was a machine of indifference. To the people streaming past, he was simply an obstacle. The piano was something to walk around. The music was just part of the background noise, like the hum of the ventilation system or the recorded announcements. People were too tired, too stressed, and too focused on their own problems to let a stranger's music into their hearts. They walked with their heads down, their eyes on their screens, or their minds lost in their worries. One teenager walked by with large headphones on, bobbing his head to his own music, completely oblivious to the masterpiece being played live right beside him. A woman in a rush stopped briefly to tie her shoe right next to the piano, using the bench for support, but she never once looked at the man or acknowledged the music cascading down around her. She just stood up, checked her watch, and ran off toward the tracks. The old man reached the climax of the song. His fingers trembled slightly with the effort, but they didn't miss a beat. He poured everything he had into the final bars, his body leaning forward, putting his soul into the sound. He hit the final chords, a series of deep, resonant notes that echoed powerfully against the high ceiling. And then, silence. He lifted his hands from the keys and rested them on his lap. He sat there for a moment, breathing deeply, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the music had been. Not a single person clapped. There was no applause, no cheering, no acknowledgement at all. The crowd just kept moving. The flow of pedestrians continued like a river around a rock. The silence was broken only by the sound of a train arriving on a lower level and the distant cough of a security guard. The old man sighed, a very small sound that was lost in the noise of the station. He looked down at his hands. They ached a little, the joints stiffening up in the cool air. He flexed his fingers, feeling the ghost of the melody still tingling in his fingertips. He was used to this. He didn't play for applause anymore. He played because the silence in his apartment was too loud, and because the music was the only thing that made him feel like he still existed. He sat on the bench, just another piece of furniture in a busy hallway, waiting for the feeling of the song to fade away so he could gather the strength to stand up and go home. He watched the feet of the passers-by, the sneakers, the boots, the dress shoes scuffing the floor as they hurried on with their lives, none of them knowing that they had just walked past a ghost of greatness. They had walked past magic, and they hadn't even noticed. Inside the bustling station, a young woman was fighting her way through the river of people. She looked like any other commuter trying to get home, but she carried a heavy load that had nothing to do with the backpack slung over her shoulder. Her mind was a storm of stress and worry. She had just come from a disappointing meeting at the university where she was studying to become a teacher. Her professors had told her that her playing was perfect, technically, but it had no soul. It was a hard thing to hear, and it made her question everything she had worked for. She was tired, her feet hurt from standing all day, and she just wanted to find a quiet corner to sit and maybe drink a bottle of water before catching her train. But the station was packed. There were no empty seats on the metal benches, and every corner seemed to be occupied by someone talking loudly on the phone or eating a messy lunch. She sighed, feeling a lump of frustration forming in her throat. She decided to walk through the main atrium to see if it was less crowded on the other side. As she walked, trying to keep her head down and avoid bumping into anyone, a sound cut through the noise of the crowd. It wasn't the usual announcement about train delays or the screech of metal wheels on tracks. It was music, but it wasn't the fuzzy, distorted sound of street musicians playing guitars with open cases on the floor. This was a piano. A real, full-sized grand piano. The young woman stopped walking for a second. She had passed through the station hundreds of times, and usually, the piano was either silent or being banged on by a tourist who didn't know how to play. But this was different. The sound was rich, clear, and surprisingly beautiful. It floated above the chaotic noise of the station like a bird flying high above a storm. Curious, she changed her path. Instead of heading straight for the exit, she moved toward the source of the music. As she got closer, she began to analyze what she was hearing. It was a habit she couldn't turn off. She listened to the timing of the notes. The person playing wasn't rushing. They were taking their time, letting every note breathe. It was a classical piece, something complicated from the old days, but it was being played with a gentle touch that made it feel brand new. She stepped around a family blocking the walkway, the father yelling at a child to drop a half-eaten pretzel. The young woman squeezed past them, her eyes fixed on the black piano in the distance. She saw a small crowd of people standing near it, but they weren't watching the player. They were looking at their phones or waiting for someone, using the piano as just a landmark to meet at. Then, she finally saw who was sitting on the bench. From far away, she expected to see a student, maybe someone from the music college downtown who was practicing for a recital. Or perhaps a professional musician in a suit killing time between gigs. But when she got close enough to see the player clearly, she stopped in her tracks. It was an old man. He looked to be in his late 70s or maybe 80s. He wore a simple, faded jacket that looked like it had been hanging in a closet for 20 years. His posture was a bit slumped, as if the weight of his life was pressing down on his shoulders. He looked small and fragile against the massive, shiny black piano. The young woman felt a spark of skepticism. She crossed her arms and tilted her head to the side. It didn't make sense to her. She had been taught that playing at this level required youth, energy, and hours of brutal daily practice. How could this frail old man produce such a powerful sound? She assumed he must be playing a simple song, or maybe he was just retired and playing for fun. She took a few steps closer, the crowd flowing around her like water around a stone. She wanted to see his hands. She knew that hands tell the true story of a musician. She looked down at the keyboard. What she saw made her mouth fall open slightly. His hands were weathered and spotted with age, the skin thin and papery. The knuckles were swollen. But despite their appearance, they moved with a speed and precision that was shocking. His fingers danced across the keys, jumping from one end to the other with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his age. It was like watching an old tree suddenly burst into bloom. He wasn't just hitting the right notes. He was shaping them. He was pressing the keys deep, digging into the sound to pull out the emotion hidden inside the strings. The young woman watched his left hand, which was controlling the deep, bass notes. It was steady as a rock, giving the music a foundation that she could feel in her chest. His right hand was fluid and singing, playing the melody with a tenderness that brought a sudden stinging sensation to her eyes. She realized then that her professors were right. She knew the mechanics of the piano, the math of the music, but she didn't know this. This was something else. This was a lifetime of feeling. Every note he played sounded like a memory. It sounded like he was telling a story about love, or loss, or time slipping away. It was the soul she had been searching for, and it was sitting right here in front of her, on a wooden bench in a dirty train station. The old man's face was calm. His eyes were half closed, as if he were seeing something that nobody else in the room could see. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He didn't care that people were walking by with their luggage bumping into his bench. He was in a different world. He was alone with the music. The young woman felt a strange connection to him. She looked at the people rushing past, the man yelling into his phone, the teenager eating chips, the tourists taking selfies. None of them heard it. None of them saw the miracle happening right next to them. They saw an old man making noise. She saw a master painting with sound. A part of her wanted to turn around and run. It was intimidating to see someone play with so much heart when she felt she had so little. It made her feel small. But another part of her was rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. She needed to hear how the song ended. She needed to know if this was real, or if she was just imagining things because she was so tired and emotional. The music began to swell. The old man's hands moved faster, the rhythm becoming more urgent. It was a storm of notes, rising and falling like waves in the ocean. The young woman held her breath without realizing it. She leaned in closer, watching the way his pinky finger struck the high notes with a sharp, clear tone that cut through the air like a bell. He played a difficult run of notes, a cascade of sound that required incredible dexterity. For a split second, his hand slipped. It was a tiny mistake, a microsecond where his age showed through. His hand trembled, and a note sounded blurry. The young woman winced, feeling bad for him. But he didn't stop. He didn't get frustrated. He simply adjusted his hand, slowed down for just a fraction of a second to regain control, and then flowed right back into the melody. He recovered so smoothly that anyone who wasn't listening closely would have missed it. He turned the mistake into part of the music. That one moment changed everything for her. It proved he wasn't a machine. He was human. He was flawed, but he kept going. He was creating something beautiful despite the shaking in his hands and the noise of the world. The song was coming to an end. The old man slowed the tempo. The loud, rushing notes softened into a gentle, quiet lullaby. He played the final chords with such care, pressing the keys softly so the notes lingered in the air for a long time before fading away. When his hands finally lifted from the keyboard and rested in his lap, the silence that returned felt heavy. The young woman let out the breath she had been holding. Her heart was beating a little faster. She looked at his face again. It was a kind face, but it was a lonely face. She noticed something that she hadn't seen from a distance. On his left hand, he wore a simple silver band on his ring finger. It was tarnished and old. But on his right hand, there was a pale strip of skin on his ring finger, a tan line, as if he had worn a ring there for 50 years and only recently taken it off. She found herself staring at his hands, trying to recognize him. The way he held his wrists, the specific curve of his fingers as they hovered over the keys, it felt familiar. It reminded her of the old vinyl records her grandfather used to play. It reminded her of the photos of the great pianists from the past century. The skepticism she felt when she first walked up was gone, replaced by a deep sense of wonder. Who was this man? Why was he here, alone, playing for people who didn't even care enough to stop and listen? And why did his music make her feel like she was going to cry? The crowd swirled around them, indifferent as ever. A young man walked right between the young woman and the piano, blocking her view for a moment, laughing at a joke on his phone. The young woman sidestepped him, her eyes never leaving the old man. She felt a strong urge to do something. She couldn't just walk away. She couldn't let him sit there in silence, thinking that nobody heard him. She took a hesitant step forward, her clutch tight against her chest. She didn't know what she was going to say. She didn't want to disturb his peace. But she felt like she had to acknowledge him. She had to tell him that his music did something. It stopped one person in the crowd. It mattered. The silence that followed the final note was heavy, but not because the crowd had gone quiet to listen. It was heavy because it was empty, filled only by the rush of air from the ventilation system and the distant thud of train doors closing. The old man sat still, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He let out a long, slow breath, the kind you let out when you have been holding a heavy weight for a long time and have finally put it down. He looked at the keyboard, his eyes slightly unfocused, not really seeing the black and white keys but rather seeing something in his own mind, perhaps a memory of a different hall, a different time. The young woman stood just a few feet away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt a strange mixture of nervousness and awe. She had watched him play with the kind of skill that took a lifetime to master, yet here he was, sitting alone in a noisy, dirty station. It felt wrong to her. It felt like finding a priceless diamond lying in the gutter. She knew she couldn't just turn around and walk to her platform. If she did, she would spend the rest of her life wondering who he was. She took a small step forward, her shoes making a soft squeak on the polished stone floor. The sound seemed loud in the space between them, but the old man didn't react. He was busy wiping his hands on a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. He moved slowly, carefully. It was the movement of someone whose joints hurt, someone who felt the cold in his bones. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was trembling, and it came out quieter than she intended. The old man paused. He didn't look up right away. He finished folding the handkerchief and placed it back in his pocket. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, framed by wrinkles that went deep into his skin. He looked at her, but there was no recognition in his gaze. He looked at her the way he looked at the hundreds of other people who walked past him every day as a blur in the landscape. I was listening," she stammered, feeling suddenly foolish. She clutched her bag tighter, as if it could protect her from the embarrassment of speaking to a stranger. "I was standing over there." "You play beautifully." The old man offered a small, polite smile. It was the kind of smile people use when they are being nice but don't really want to talk. "Thank you," he said. His voice was raspy and thin, like dry leaves skittering on the pavement. "It passes the time." He moved his hands as if to place them back on the keys, perhaps to start another tune that no one would listen to. But the young woman didn't move. She took another step closer, drawn by a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. She needed to know if she was right. She needed to know if the crazy idea in her head was true. "I'm a student," she blurted out. "At the conservatory. We study the old recordings. The greats." She paused, searching his face for a reaction. "I study your recordings." The old man froze. His hands stopped in mid-air, hovering just inches above the keys. The polite smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of guarded wariness. He stiffened, his back straightening slightly. For the first time, he really looked at her. He looked into her eyes, searching for mockery or pity. When he saw only sincerity, his expression softened, but he looked sad. "You are mistaken," Young lady, he said gently, shaking his head, I am just an old man who likes to play. I am no one. No, she said, her voice gaining strength. I know what I heard. The way you hold your wrists. The way you use the pedal. You play the Rachmaninoff variations exactly like the record from 1968. She felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I know who you are. You are Arthur Vance. The name hung in the air between them like a spell. To the people rushing past, it meant nothing. Just another name. But to the old man, it was a ghost from his past. He flinched as if she had reached out and touched a fresh wound. He looked down at his hands, resting them on his knees. That name, he whispered, has been dead for a very long time. It's not dead, she insisted, taking another step closer until she was standing right beside the piano bench. I listen to that album every time I feel like giving up. My professor says no one plays with that kind of emotion anymore. He says you were the last one who truly understood the soul of the music. The old man let out a short, dry chuckle that sounded more like a cough. Your professor is a kind man to remember. But I am not the man on those records. That man had fire in his hands. This. He lifted his hand slightly, letting it drop back to his leg. This is just rust. The young woman shook her head violently. It's not rust. It's experience. You don't play like that unless you've lived every note. I saw the ring mark on your finger. And the way you looked when you played, you weren't here. You were somewhere else. Somewhere important. Arthur looked up at her, and this time, his guard came down completely. His eyes filled with a shimmering wetness. He saw the passion in her face, the genuine adoration. He realized she wasn't making fun of him. She wasn't trying to get money from him or take a picture to laugh about on the internet. She was a musician speaking to another musician. 40 years, Arthur said softly, more to himself than to her. It has been 40 years since I stood on a stage. After my wife passed, I couldn't bear the lights. I couldn't bear the applause without her there to hear it. So I walked away. I disappeared. He looked around the station at the rushing crowds. I thought if I played here, in the noise, I could just be part of the background. I could play for the echoes, and for the ghosts. I didn't think anyone would ever really listen. I listened, the young woman said firmly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It was filled with her own scribbles of music theory and notes from her classes. She flipped to a page where she had handwritten a quote, a famous line from a review of Arthur Vance's last concert. She held it out for him to see. He wrote, Vance does not play the piano, he commands the silence, she read aloud. You did that just now. You commanded the silence. Even if these people didn't stop, you changed the air in this room. Arthur looked at the handwriting, his trembling hand reaching out to trace the letters she had written. It was a connection to the life he used to have. A bridge over the gap of 40 lonely years. He looked at her, really seeing her now not just as a stranger, but as a successor, someone who carried the torch even when he had dropped it. I used to play for thousands, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Today, I played for one. And somehow, this was heavier. He wiped a tear from the corner of his eye with the sleeve of his coat. He felt exposed, like a secret door had been opened inside him that he had locked shut for decades. But it didn't feel bad. It felt like a relief. It felt like finally taking a breath after holding it underwater. You have very kind ears, Arthur said to her. A faint, Genuine smile appeared on his face, erasing years of bitterness. It made him look younger, if only for a moment. "What is your name?" she told him. It wasn't a famous name. It was just a name. But when she said it, Arthur repeated it slowly, committing it to memory, treating it with the same respect he used to treat a musical score. "Well," Arthur said, patting the bench beside him. "It seems I am not as invisible as I thought." "Not today." The young woman didn't sit down. She didn't want to intrude on his space. But she stood there, a silent guardian, making sure that for this moment, he wasn't just an old man in a station. He was Arthur Vance, the master. And she was the witness who would make sure he was never forgotten again. The young woman stood there for a moment, looking at the old man with a mix of admiration and disbelief. It felt surreal to her. She had spent years studying his recordings in dusty practice rooms, trying to decode the mystery of his sound, and here he was, sitting in front of her in a crowded train station. The disconnect between the legend she knew and the elderly man in the worn coat was striking, yet at the same time, it made perfect sense. Arthur shifted on the bench, his joints making a quiet popping sound in the brief lull of their conversation. He looked down at the keys again, his fingers tracing the edges of the ivory absent-mindedly. The spell of their private moment seemed to be breaking as the noise of the station rushed back in. A janitor with a large cleaning cart rattled past them just a few feet away, the wheels clacking loudly over the tiles. The sound was jarring and harsh, a rude reminder of the real world. "I should let you go," Arthur said softly, his voice sounding tired again. He moved his hands as if to close the lid of the keyboard, a gesture of finality. "It was kind of you to stop. It means more than you know." He didn't say it, but he was preparing to leave. He felt exposed. For 40 years, he had been safe in his invisibility. Being recognized felt like taking off a heavy coat on a cold day. You feel the warmth for a second, but then the chill hits you hard. He wasn't sure if he liked the feeling of being seen again. It brought back memories that were painful, memories of a life that had ended too soon. "No, please," the young woman said quickly. She stepped closer, placing a hand on the side of the piano to stop him. "Don't go yet." Arthur looked up at her, his pale eyes questioning. "I have played my song, miss. The people need to walk. The station is no place for a concert." "The people don't know what they're hearing," she said, her voice gaining a fierce, protective edge. She looked around at the rushing commuters. Her eyes flashed with a determination that surprised her. Usually, she was shy, the type to blend into the background at school. But something about the injustice of the situation gave her courage. It made her angry that the world could walk past such greatness and not even blink. She turned back to him, her expression softening. "I'm not asking for a concert. I'm asking you to play one more time. Just for me. But, not a quiet piece this time. Play something that forces them to stop. Play something they can't ignore." Arthur let out a small, dry chuckle and shook his head slowly. "You have the spirit of a conductor," he said. "But I am old. My hands are stiff. I cannot compete with the noise of this place. The trains are too loud, the people are too busy. Music like mine requires silence. It requires ears that are willing to work." "You create the silence," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a challenge. That's what the greats do. They don't wait for the world to be quiet. They make the world be quiet. Arthur looked at her. He saw the genuine belief in her eyes. She wasn't just flattering him. She truly believed that he still had that power. He looked down at his hands again. They were trembling slightly, a constant tremor that had started 5 years ago. He remembered the days when his hands were steady as rocks, when he could pound out the most difficult passages without breaking a sweat. Those days were gone. But deep down, beneath the arthritis and the age, the fire was still there. It was just buried under layers of grief and time. "Very well," Arthur whispered. "One more." "But only because you asked." He didn't play immediately. First, he adjusted his position on the bench. He sat up straighter, pulling his shoulders back. The tired, slumped posture of the invisible old man vanished. In its place was the rigid, disciplined bearing of a master pianist. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the stale station air, and let it out slowly, centering himself. He placed his hands on the keys, but he didn't press them down yet. He hovered there, feeling the electricity of the moment. He closed his eyes for a second, blocking out the visual chaos of the station. He shut out the bright lights, the signs, the crowds. In the darkness of his mind, he saw a concert hall. He felt the weight of the expectation, the hush of 1,000 people waiting for the first note. The young woman stepped back a few paces to give him space, but she didn't leave. She turned her body so she was facing the crowd, not just the piano. She stood like a sentinel, watching the people flow past. Then, Arthur's hands came down. It wasn't a gentle start this time. He struck the keys with a force that made the piano body shudder. The sound was a sudden, sharp crack of thunder that cut through the ambient noise of the station like a knife. It was a chord of pure intensity, demanding attention. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The river of people kept flowing. A businessman talking on his phone walked right by, frowning at the sudden loud noise but not even breaking his sentence. But Arthur didn't let up. He launched into a fast, aggressive opening passage. It was a storm of notes, cascading and tumbling over one another. The rhythm was driving and relentless. It was the kind of music that grabbed you by the collar and shook you. He poured every ounce of his remaining strength into the sound, attacking the piano with a ferocity that seemed impossible for a man of his age. The young woman watched the crowd. She saw a man walking past with a coffee cup. At the first blast of sound, he stumbled, nearly spilling his drink. He stopped and turned toward the piano, annoyed. But he didn't keep walking. The annoyance on his face turned to confusion, and then to curiosity. He stopped dead in his tracks. It was like a ripple effect. A few yards away, a couple who were arguing over a map stopped fighting. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes drawn to the source of the powerful sound. A group of teenagers, who were laughing loudly and shoving each other, suddenly went quiet. They looked at the old man, their mocking grins fading away. They had never seen anyone play like that with such total abandon and fury. Arthur was lost in the music now. His tremor seemed to vanish, replaced by the sheer momentum of the piece. His eyes were closed, his head swaying rhythmically. He wasn't thinking about the people anymore. He was playing for the young woman who had recognized him. He was playing to prove to himself that he still existed. The music swelled, rising to a crescendo that vibrated the floor beneath the onlookers' feet. The sound was so big, so full, that it seemed to push the walls of the station back. The chaotic noise of the trains and the announcements seemed to fade away, defeated by the sheer power of the melody. More people stopped. A man in a suit, who had been rushing to catch a train, slowed his pace. He looked at his watch, then looked at the piano. He hesitated for a second, torn between his schedule and the music. The music won. He stepped out of the flow of traffic and stood still. A mother with a stroller stopped. The baby had been crying, fussing in the seat. As the rich, deep notes of the piano washed over them, the baby quieted down, listening intently to the sound. The mother looked at the old man with a soft expression of wonder. The young woman watched all of this with tears streaming down her face. She felt a sense of vindication, but also a deep sense of awe. She knew this was a miracle. In a world where everyone was rushing, where everyone was looking at screens and ignoring each other, this old man had stopped them. He had used the universal language of music to cut through the static of modern life. A small crowd began to form. It wasn't an organized audience, it was just a collection of people who had been snatched out of their busy lives. They stood in a semicircle around the piano, leaving a respectful gap between themselves and the bench. They were different colors, different ages, different backgrounds. But for that moment, they were all the same. They were all listeners. Arthur didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to see them to know they were there. He could feel the change in the air. He could feel the energy of the room shifting from chaotic indifference to focused attention. The silence around the music was no longer empty, it was heavy with presence. It was the silence of a concert hall, recreated magically in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in a transport hub. He played on, his fingers flying, the notes blurring together in a dazzling display of skill. He poured his regret, his love, his solitude, and his joy into the instrument. He was giving the crowd a piece of his soul, and they were taking it, hungry for something real in a fake world. The young woman looked at Arthur's face. It was transformed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a look of intense concentration and peace. This was where he belonged. Not in the shadows, but in the light. He was no longer a ghost. He was alive, and he was finally being heard. The music finally reached its peak, a thunderous roll of sound that seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling rafters. Then, in a heartbeat, the old man lifted his hands high into the air. The crashing notes stopped instantly, leaving only the vibration of the strings hanging in the silence. Arthur sat frozen, his chest heaving up and down. The exertion had taken a toll on his frail body. He could feel a thin line of sweat running down his temple, and his hands were trembling not from age this time, but from the sheer force of the emotion he had poured out. He kept his eyes closed for a long moment, terrified of what he would find when he opened them. He expected to hear the immediate shuffle of feet, the coughs, and the return of the indifference. He thought he had imagined a change in the atmosphere, that he had only played to ghosts and ghosts did not clap. But then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a cough. It wasn't a phone ringing. It was the sound of two hands clapping together, slowly and rhythmically. Arthur opened his eyes and turned his head. It was the young woman. She was standing exactly where he had left her, tears streaming openly down her face, clapping her hands together with a force that made her palms sting. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't looking at her watch. She was looking only at him. Then, a second person joined in. A man in a gray suit, the one who had been rushing to his train, put his briefcase down and began to clap. Then the mother with the stroller. Then the teenagers who had stopped laughing. The sound grew rapidly, swelling from a gentle patter into a wave of genuine, thunderous applause. The station, usually a place of cold rushing and noise, had transformed completely. A large crowd had gathered in a semicircle around the piano. There must have been 50 people standing there now, maybe more. They had stopped walking. They had stopped worrying about their schedules. They were just standing there, smiling, some with their own eyes watery, all of them directing their attention to the old man on the bench. Arthur stared at them, his mouth slightly open. He felt a rush of heat to his face that had nothing to do with the physical effort of playing. He felt exposed, but in a good way. For 40 years, he had felt like he was disappearing, fading away like a photograph left in the sun. But now, in this bright, noisy hall, he felt solid. He felt seen. He slowly stood up. His legs were stiff, and he had to use the piano for support to push himself up. As he rose, the applause grew louder. Some people even cheered. It was a raw, unpolished sound, completely different from the polite applause of a VIP concert hall. This was real. This was from the heart. The young woman stepped forward from the crowd. She didn't say anything. She just reached out and gently took his arm to steady him. She looked up at him with a look of pure pride, as if she had known him her whole life. "You did it," she whispered loudly enough for him to hear over the noise. "You made them stop." Arthur looked at her, and then he looked out at the sea of faces. He saw a young girl holding her mother's hand, looking at him with wide, sparkling eyes. He saw an old man leaning on a cane, nodding his head in respect. He saw tired workers with their ties loosened, looking relaxed for the first time all day. A feeling of warmth spread through Arthur's chest, melting away the years of loneliness. He realized that he hadn't lost his gift. The music was still there, dormant but alive, waiting for the right moment to wake up. He had thought the world didn't want to hear him anymore, but he was wrong. The world had just been too busy to stop. Once the music grabbed them, they remembered. They remembered that they had souls. He raised a shaking hand to acknowledge the crowd. He didn't bow like a performer in a tuxedo. He just gave a small, humble nod and a tired, grateful smile. It was a smile that said, "Thank you for seeing me." The crowd began to disperse slowly. People had trains to catch and places to be, but the energy was different now. As they walked away, they weren't looking at their phones. They were talking to each other, pointing back at the piano. A young man walked past Arthur and patted him gently on the shoulder. "That was beautiful, sir," he said, before rushing off to catch his train. The young woman stayed until the crowd had thinned out. She helped Arthur put on his coat. "Are you going to come back tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice so she wouldn't pressure him. Arthur looked at the piano. The black and white keys seemed to gleam under the station lights. For years, this instrument had been a companion to his solitude, a place to hide. Now, it felt like a bridge. "I think," Arthur said slowly, his voice raspy but stronger than before, "that I have wasted too much time being quiet. I believe I will come back. There are still so many songs left in these fingers." The young woman beamed at him. "I'll be here," she promised. "And I'll bring others. Students. Teachers. They need to hear this." Arthur patted her hand. "You do that," he said. "But for now, I need to go home and rest. My hands are tired." He walked away from the piano, his step a little lighter than it had been when he arrived. The girl watched him go, carrying his worn bag and his dignity, moving through the crowd that was already rushing again. But he wasn't invisible anymore. Even as he merged into the stream of people, a few heads turned. People recognized him. They whispered to each other, pointing at the old man in the coat. They didn't know his name, maybe. They didn't know his history. But they knew the music. And as the noise of the station swelled up again to its usual roar, The echo of the piano still lingered in the air. It was a reminder that magic exists in the most ordinary places, if you are only brave enough to stop and listen. The old man walked out into the city evening, no longer a ghost, but a master who had finally found his audience again.